you're finally sworn in and you get your first assignment. Is it all you thought it was going to be?
Yeah. I wanted to go out and fight crime, and I was all excited, and I was 19, and I was had the uniform and I had the accoutrements and whatever, and I didn't have a gun in those days. I wasn't. Yeah, I thought, I'll see whether we should carry one or not, because it was voluntary. But my very first assignment, day one, I'm excited, and the sergeant said, "Okay, get the police car and drive down to a school crossing and make sure the kids get across to the bus." Okay, I went, right. Okay, that's not the exciting first day that I thought I'd have. Whereas some of my friends were being posted to stations that were really busy, that were doing police work, and there I was in this sleepy little inner suburban police station. I think we may have had maybe 4 police, whereas other stations had 20. So, and again, because I was bristling with impatience, I thought, oh, really?
Didn't you go to complain and try to get that changed? And you were like, nope, sorry,
Yeah.
you're going there.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, sorry about that.
So you weren't there for very long, though, were you?
No, I was there for a couple of months, I think. But you have to be careful what you wish for, because within, I think, 6 weeks of my first day, we went to a domestic disturbance call, which unfortunately was so common and probably still is, where men batter their partners, it still makes me angry. So turned up to this domestic violence call, knocked on the door, and the door opened, and the husband produced a pump action shotgun and put it in my face, and I thought, well, that was a short-lived career. I really thought I was going to die, and I thought, oh, and these things that go through your mind are bizarre. So people can read about that, but fortunately, the other cop had a firearm, had a revolver, and he pulled it out and pointed at this guy and said, "You shoot him and I'll shoot you." So we all decided that wasn't a good idea for him to shoot me, I guess. And I make light of it, but it was pretty bloody scary. And then the very next day, I sat at a typewriter and typed up an application for a police revolver, and I never went anywhere without one again, because I realised that there were people out there who played for keeps, and that could have been the end of my life. And I know there are all differing views about police being armed, but I wasn't going to be one that needed it and didn't have it. And I think that probably set the path of the rest of my career, where I thought, right, this job can kill you, and you need to be aware of that every day. And then I was transferred to Walk the Beat, the classic Walking the Beat in the city. Loved it, because even I was still a shy kid, but it gave me a lot of confidence to actually meet people and talk to. It's the same in the UK, I'm sure, where cops walk the beat and they talk to shop owners and restaurateurs and the cinema operators and all of that stuff. And I loved it, and it was a busy time. I think the Australian sport was try and punch a cop in the head on a Wednesday night when you've had too many pints. So yeah, we were busy. And I was there for, I can't remember really, maybe a year in that particular place. And then I became aware that there was an even more exciting place to work, a uniformed mobile patrol area. And I wanted to be one of them, because the older police sergeants thought they were cowboys. Look at these cowboys, and they thought they were cowboys because they didn't operate from a station and sit behind a desk and wait for things to come to them. The mobile patrol unit was on the road all the time and responding to urgent matters and stopping people who were up to no good. And actually, it was just an amazing place to be. And so I was lucky enough to finally get transferred there. I think I might have had, I operate by years, so I probably had about 18 months, maybe a bit less than 18 months service, and I thought I was a veteran. And I went and worked in this amazing place, and it was so much of what I wanted to be. It was where I could actually be a cop and take people off the street and protect victims and all of that stuff that I just loved. I didn't want to go on holidays or vacation. Not many of us did because we were worried we'd miss out on something. That's how exciting it was. Yeah, so I was there for about 2 years, I think. And then the next stage of my police career started.
Was that time where they would shoot blanks at each other and there was a call
Yeah,
and you were driving? Yeah, that
all
one.
the stupid stuff we used to do. Yeah. God, and again, that's what I wanted to put in that book to show the reality of policing. It's not like the movies. So when we were bored, I don't know what genius came up with this idea, but someone introduced the concept of blanks to us. So, the stuff they use in the movie sets. So we'd drive around and shoot each other with blanks, and I still shake my head at it. And one night we were having a fun time doing all of that, and there was a real life shooting right in the middle of the city, about 2 blocks away. And as we drove down there with our lights and sirens on to respond, there was a uniformed car sitting beside on the road, and these guys were quickly emptying out the blanks on their revolvers and replacing them with real bullets. And then we all had a realization that probably wasn't a sensible thing to do anymore.
It just made me laugh how I can't remember who it was. They just looked up and gave you a big smile and said, "Oh, won't be doing that again."
That's right. Yeah, that was Peter. He was larger than life, that guy.
But this is how you came to want more, wasn't it? Because of what happened afterwards.
Yeah, it was a while later, and again we had a shots fired call, which are the calls that used to happen a lot in Australia, actually, because you could buy high-powered weapons, rifles, shotguns without a license anywhere in any sporting store. Everybody had guns. It was just, what the way of life, I suppose.
Sorry, just out of interest, what's it like now? Is it the same now, or?
No, after we finally had enough. There'd been massacres in Australia, 10, 12, 15 people killed with rifles and so on. And there was one in 1998, I think, in Port Arthur in Tasmania. Can't remember how many people were murdered, but it was well over 35 who were murdered and others wounded by a lunatic who just had a high-powered rifle and decided to kill people. So the government just went, and that's it, that's enough. And they had an amnesty. Law-abiding people handed their rifles and shotguns in and they were compensated for it. And now you just cannot buy them. You need a specific license and it needs to be vetted and so on. A lot of outcry about it, but I personally think it's a much better thing. The paradox of that is that people still kill their partners. But what they do now is they don't shoot them. They stab them, they bludgeon them, they set them on fire. So it's just, again, that's the dark side of society, isn't it? So we'd heard a shots fired call and turned up, and I saw a bunch of scruffy people running around, and a young guy with shoulder-length hair, handcuffed, sitting against a car. And as we jumped out to respond, they said they announced they were the drug squad. And I went, okay. So there'd been an attempted buy-bust on a drug dealer. He tried to escape. Someone shot the tyre out in the car. That was the shot fired reported. And then one of these detectives said, grab our undercover and throw him in the back of your car, make it look good, and take him back to CIB headquarters. And I went, I wasn't aware we had undercovers. And so did that, threw him in the back of the car to make it look good. And as we got in, he called me by my name and said, "G'day, Banksy, how you doing?" I looked and went, wow, this was a guy who was, I think, 1 or 2 years junior to me in the academy. And that's what they did in those days. They'd sometimes drag fresh-faced kids out of the academy and throw them into the undercover world. And as soon as I realised that existed, I wanted to be one. And I wanted to be one for, and I'll be honest about it, the adventure. It was cool to me that you could actually grow your hair, you could wear an earring, you could look like as unlike a cop as you possibly could, and it was all okay. And after having, 2 years in the academy with short hair, and that was in the 70s. So this is like 1980. Short hair in men was still not fashionable. It was still the hangover from that era. So, I thought, yeah, that would be kind of cool. But I was also inspired to do something that was genuine to fight the heroin trade. In Australia in the late 1970s, there was a flood of heroin into the country. Um, our borders were impossible to control, and some could argue probably still are difficult to control. Um, the heroin was being flown in, shipped in, etc., through a syndicate run by a man called Terence John Clark, who was a New Zealander. And he made millions and millions and millions out of importing heroin. The impact on young people in Australia was those who were using it, and it was a pretty middle class drug. So not like the USA, where it's quite it's a drug that was favoured in lower socioeconomic areas. This was a middle class drug, and people were dying of overdoses, just literally keeling over of overdoses, and I use literally the correct way, all across the country. And I'd been to quite a few overdoses as a young mobile patrol cop, and you see a kid curled up in the gutter with a syringe still in his arm or her arm, and they've died of heroin overdoses because the purity was so good. And we saw that happen again in the late 1980s with the influx of heroin from the Golden Triangle. But that's another, sorry, the Golden Triangle was Clark, but this was coming in from Vietnam. So I thought, this would be a beautiful way to literally do something. I said literally again. I sound like a millennial. To This would be a great way to do something to genuinely fight that trade, which I regarded as an evil trade and still do. The problem was I didn't know how much it would change me, and I was very naive when I started. So volunteered for it, was recommended to do it, went and met the officer in charge of the drug squad, and he said, yeah, I think you'll be right. Take some leave, grow your hair, grow a beard, because cops weren't allowed to grow beards in those days, and then come back. And I came back in my first day, and I was given a small semi-automatic pistol, some false number plates, false driver's license, because we operated under assumed identities, and then basically thrown out into the world with another undercover cop to watch how he operated, and then go and do it all myself. So there was no psychological assessment. There was no screening. There was absolutely zero training. What you learned was on the job. And you really coped in a sink or swim situation. And as much as I enjoyed what I did as an undercover most of the time, because I got some very good results in putting heroin dealers in jail, I know full well that it changed me as a person. It ruined the lives of some of my friends, and I've written about Harry particularly in the first book. And we were regarded by drug squad operators, not all of them, but enough of them, we were regarded as just, I've called it meat on the hoof. That's a particularly Australian term, but we were regarded as just collateral damage, I guess. We were young kids, we're all under the age of 25, who they could throw out into the field, didn't really care what risk we were at, whether that be physical or psychological or emotional. Bad luck. We were good at what we did, and it made the detectives look good because their arrest rates went up. And that's how I call it. Things these days are markedly different, and I'm aware of what I'm sort of aware of what happens now, but I'm not going to talk about it because that's just not the right thing to do. But certainly, that covert world, the operatives are much, much, much better supported and monitored, which so they should be. So I spent 2 years doing that. I finished that, and we can talk about some undercover experiences, of course, but I finished that and came back to the real world, or as I called it, resurfacing into the real world with a completely different view. I had gone in with a black and white perspective of the world, and I know now and knew when I finished that it's simply shades of grey. There is no black and white. There are people who do bad things. It doesn't make them bad people necessarily. There are people on the side of the angels who aren't very nice people at all. So I was meeting and dealing with some drug dealers who I quite liked, even though they were dealing in a substance that ruined lives. Um, and then I was dealing with some police officers who I didn't like at all because they had no morals and they were corrupt, and they were just not very nice individuals. And that's a real dichotomy, of trying to retain your identity and your moral compass and remembering who you are, and then seeing all of this, and that was challenging. Um, I certainly, and again, I used to regard all drugs as evil, and cannabis, I'd legalize it tomorrow if I could, and I felt that way for the last 40 years. Break the connection of organized crime. People are going to smoke weed. Why the hell is it criminalized? Because it is a drug that's very similar to alcohol. It just doesn't have the same effects as alcohol. I've never seen someone smoking weed bashing their partner. All they'll do is have a dispute over, whose turn it is to make the tea. And even then it's, oh, come on, man, it's your turn. No, man, it's my turn. And I've had this debate with many, many people. And the thing about cannabis being a gateway drug, cannabis is a gateway drug because the same people that are selling you a bag of cannabis are the same people that will sell you meth. And they're the same people that will sell you heroin. I'm not sure what the drug situation is in the UK, but that's been my experience. If you break that nexus and then you have a situation where, cannabis is legally provided in outlets, the quality is controlled, tax the hell out of it, and then put that tax into health and education, all makes sense to me. And you break the gateway. I've smoked a lot of cannabis as an undercover, and subsequently from time to time. I make no bones about that. I haven't turned into someone who needs to use ice or heroin or cocaine or acid or meth or whatever. So I've just gone off on a whole tangent, and I think the whole drug law situation is flawed. The criminalisation of drugs has resulted directly in cartels. It's resulted in, God, hundreds of thousands of murders around the world, corruption of officials, ruin of lives, etc. And I'm firmly convinced that we need to start looking at this from a health and risk minimisation perspective rather than enforcement. Can't arrest your way out of it. So back to the 80s. Clearly, I have a point of view about this.
Since you're talking about that, so you went into the undercover world because, there was a big problem. Do you think you made any impact in the 2 years you were undercover?
I didn't think so. I really didn't, But after my first book was published, and I'd spoken about that, because that's a great question. I had a friend contact me who was ironically the first undercover cop that worked with me and taught me some things. And he said, mate, I've listened to what you've said. I've read what you've said, but what you have to think about is we did make an impact because we've saved lives by taking dealers off the street that we'll never know about. So it's the whole sliding doors thing, isn't it? So you don't know whose lives you've positively impacted by having dealers put in jail. You don't know whose lives you've positively impacted by just other things you've done as an undercover. I think to answer your question, we did have an impact, but it was short-lived. It's like the seven-headed hydra. You cut one off and seven take its place. And that's really informed my whole opinion about drug reform because, and I saw it. We'd finish an operation, all the dealers would be arrested in a certain place, and within days the vacuum would be filled by others. So, but I guess that's the nature of policing. That's a whole philosophical conversation you could have around policing anyway. Is it there to stem the tide? Is it like the boy with his finger in the dike? Is it, how can you measure it? How can you measure it? I think cops are there really just to protect people from anarchy, and that's sounds a bit, um, maudlin and pessimistic, but I just think that's all we can do. That's why we need to support them as much as we can.
So knowing what you know now and how it's really affected you, the undercover side of it, if you could go back, would you still do it again? Did you think it was something you needed to do?
Yeah, I would. And I would, and I say that without hesitation, because if I hadn't had that experience, I wouldn't have what I see as a more realistic attitude in the world. And if I hadn't done that, I would have spent the rest of my career being a black and white cop, I think. Or I may have matured, but it certainly helped me mature. It gave me more emotional intelligence much more quickly than I would have. So I had the ability to talk to people and look at it from their side of the world, you know. Um, Even people I'd arrest for armed robbery, I'd sit in there later in my career. I'd sit in there and look at them and go, okay. I'd think to myself, I wonder what you've been through, and I wonder what your childhood and your experiences have been through to lead you down this path. And that helped me a lot, establishing some rapport with people, because I could be a hard guy if I wanted to, or wrong. I could be a hard guy when I had to be, but I didn't start off that way in dealing with offenders unless, they were threatening my life or someone else's life directly. Um, and and I don't know whether I'm explaining that properly, but it just gave me, I think, not a softness, but yeah, a more empathetic nature towards offenders than I probably would have had.
But just what happened later on in your career again, which we'll get to, but it was Rocky. You were able to
Yeah.
empathise with his situation, whereas other police officers weren't able to.
Yeah.
So that was quite interesting.
Yeah, that's right. That was years, and you're right. That was years later, and that was when we were protecting Rocky. I know his real name. Um, he was a mafia witness, or a witness against a mafia, quite senior mafia figures, and we were armed and protecting him for 6 months. And you're right. I developed a real friendship with him because I could understand him much more than anyone else, and vice versa. And again, had I not been an undercover cop, I would have treated him probably the same as the others did, most of the others did, which was, you're a witness, you've been a crook, and we're going to treat you as such. Whereas I became quite close to him. Yeah.
Yeah, had a lovely time when he was with you,
Yeah,
didn't
yeah,
he?
yeah.
Out at the bars
Yeah,
and those
yeah.
girls.
Well, see, I just realised, you can't lock this poor guy away, and so I created a bit of a culture in the team, and I broke a lot of rules in my time. And the culture in my team was, we'll take him out and we'll buy him some beers because he needs to be human and relax. We're not going to drink when it's our turn to be on shift because there's a real threat in his life. But when the other crew turned up to relieve us of our time, then I go, right, now I'm going to have a few beers with him and enjoy his company. Totally against the rules, but it worked, and so I just thought, he was prepared to give evidence against some very senior mafia people for a murder that he'd been involved in, not as a participant, but he knew had happened, and his evidence would have convicted them for sure. So I felt it was our job to make sure that he was comfortable. And the byproduct was, yeah, I really enjoyed him. I think about his little cheeky laugh and his grin every now and then. Yeah, if it had not been for his circumstances, he would have probably would have made a good cop.
Really?
Mm,
It's
yeah,
sad how that turned out as well, but you
yeah,
have to read the book if you want to find out what
indeed you do.
happened.
Indeed you do.
So you came out of being undercover, but you were tricked, weren't you, with your next job? They kind of tricked you, didn't they?
Yeah, I came out and I just needed excitement in my life, and so I went back to uniform for 6 months. I think, as we needed. some discipline apparently, and they were right. Um, and and then I became a junior or a trainee detective. So I was in the criminal investigation branch. I'm not sure what it's called in Scotland, but the criminal investigation. Um, and then I worked in a couple of areas there, and then back to the drug squad. But in the meantime, um, I found out, or I realised, not found out, I saw some footage of a domestic siege, a high-risk siege with, again, guns. And we had a team of the emergency squad, they were termed in those days, so armed offenders squad. And I looked at these guys running around in black jumpsuits and, assault rifles and whatever, and thought, okay, I need to be one of them now. So, so I applied for that and was successful in getting that. And around that time, the Special Air Service were travelling the country training all of the state response teams. So, getting ready for the Commonwealth Games in Queensland. And, terrorism had taken on, a worldwide platform of aircraft hijack, murders, and just some horrible things that were happening. So part of our gamut changed from just domestic sieges and high risk raids to counterterrorism. So I did that on a part-time basis and loved it, because again, you're a young man, it's exciting. You're jumping out of helicopters and firing submachine guns and blowing stuff up and, shooting at targets and also we were engaged because we're on a part-time basis. So we're engaged from time to time to respond to domestic sieges, to do high-risk raids on armed offenders. So it was exciting, and I'd developed this whole need for adrenaline and fear through being undercover. And it's hard to explain, but it just wouldn't, I couldn't settle back to being a normal cop. But at the same time, I went back to the drug squad as a young detective, and I was suckered back into doing undercover work because we only had a handful of UCs at the time, and so I was put back into doing some undercover roles and so on. And I went to Cairns, where I've just come from, with my colleague Larry, who I've written fondly about. And Larry had been undercover for almost 5 years, I think, and he was just completely burned out. So we went to Cairns. I was initially there as his controller or his exhibit officer, but I ended up working with him side by side. So we went through an interesting experience in Cairns. We had a list of targets, but we met someone on the periphery who we were buying a lot of drugs from. And again, we got on well with, or so I thought. And
That was a shocker.
and I was recognised by a schoolmate in a bar one night who was serving behind the bar. Although I'd grown a big beard again, I had long hair, and I thought, nah. Anyway, he recognised me. So I had to do some pretty fast talking to talk my way out of that, because the bad guy was standing right beside me, and of course I was using a different name. At the end of the operation, when he was arrested, he admitted to the detectives that he'd been planning to kill me for the money that I was going to pay for a big drug deal he was setting up. And I was planning to arrest him. And I turned to the investigator and said, well, gee, that's not very good. I thought we were mates. So I guess that's just one story that shows how dangerous that world can be.
He was wanted. He'd escaped prison, hadn't
He'd
he?
escaped prison in South
Yeah.
Australia for a double murder,
Yeah.
yeah. And
I couldn't believe that.
and yeah, he'd murdered 2 people in cold blood, just because I think he wanted some money from them or something, and there was nothing, so he shot him anyway. And yeah, so but then after I came back from that job, there was a conversation that some detectives had with Larry and me in we had what was called a police club, which was a licensed bar where, cops could go to, and you could only get in there if you were a cop or if you're a guest. So it was a nice place, a bit of, what's the word I'm looking for? not so much solitude, but a bit of an isolated place where you can enjoy a drink without having to worry about someone overhearing what you're saying. And there were 4 detectives that just walked up to us and surrounded us and made us an offer. And that offer was they had seized a lot of heroin that obviously they hadn't declared. And they wanted it sold on the street, and they wanted us to do it for them for a 50% profit split. And I remember thinking, the audacity of you bastards to do this in a police club. Just thinking full well that you have indemnity to do it, or it just made me angry, and I just had to swallow that down and just say, look, guys, no, sorry, it's too risky, because I knew in those days these were pretty corrupt days with a certain cohort of very powerful police. It was before we had our corruption inquiry or our Royal Commission, so if you weren't careful in those days and you said no to something like this, you could well find that there would be illicit drugs planted in your house or stolen property planted in your house somewhere, with people from internal investigations waiting to execute a warrant. So I was very conscious you could be set up, because it had happened. I was very conscious you could be transferred overnight to somewhere way out in the country that was not a very pleasant place to be. So I just said, no, probably not for us, guys. We're just, we're too nervous about this shit, because we know how easy it is to get caught. And then they didn't talk to us again. But within, it's probably, I don't know, maybe a month or two, I had a phone call at home telling me that I was being moved to a suburban CIB office that was not in the specialist operations area anymore, and that was it.
But that was only for 6 weeks. They said it's only for
Yeah,
6
I was
weeks.
told I'd be out there for 6 weeks, and I turned up, and the detective sergeant in charge said, mate, no, you've been transferred here permanently. But, it was the best thing that could have happened to me, because took me a little while to acclimatise. I was pretty annoyed. But then I started working and doing normal detective investigation work, which was, a gamut of things from minor petty theft to rape. And so that was good experience for me. But more importantly, I was sitting there on a Friday night, just with the detectives in the office, having a customary drink after a working week. And I realised, wow, I know what this is. I had an absolute sense that I could trust them completely. Whereas the drug area I'd worked in, I couldn't trust. I could only trust a very few completely. And here I was thinking, wow, I guess this is what normal policing is like. And it was almost, again, a big sigh of relief, to think, wow, I've moved somewhere that I can actually be myself and not have to worry about looking over my shoulder about, who's taking money and who's selling drugs. And yeah, so it was the best thing they could have done to me.
Yeah, they thought they were getting one over on you, but really, they did you a favour.
Yeah, it did me a huge favour, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So from here, you were in the emergency squad, part-time when you were needed. And then you just kept going. It was just like, after that, it was like you trained for the bomb disposal and you trained for tactical, and you just kept going. You were just always wanting the next thing from there, weren't you?
Yeah, I loved it. I knew that it was I knew it was somewhere that I was good at, and because I'd trained a lot. I still exercised ferociously. I always kept myself very fit, because again I thought that's what you should be doing. And in the tactical world, it was not your normal policing. So working with the SAS was amazing, um, and so I was approached by the inspector in charge of the tactical area to move from being a detective to that area as one of the first full-time operators. Um, and he knew what he was asking me to give up, because being a designated detective is a pretty cool thing. It's a pretty big thing in policing, and but I could see the future, and I knew that this sort of work was going to be more and more needed. Um, and so I went, yep, jumped at the opportunity, and a guy called Peter and I were the first full-time operators. And and I was sent to work with the army for a month in Victoria at an army base, and that was doing a bomb disposal course. And the thing about bomb disposal is, in order to disrupt them, you need to know how to make them. So you can just imagine it. I'm full of adventure and I want to do all this cool stuff. So I'm learning how to make IEDs and then taking the range and then detonating them and going, right, that's excellent. I love all that. And then learning how to dismantle them, either by hand, like they do in the movies, but there is no cut the yellow wire, cut the blue wire. That's all rubbish, but it's another story. But learning how to use robots to disrupt explosive devices. A lot of the stuff we were being taught had been learned by the British in the Northern Ireland conflict. So a lot of the bombs that the provos had been making and planting and detonating in the UK, a lot of that knowledge was provided to the Australian Army and in turn provided to us. So it's a pretty cool thing to go through. And what I did also learn, and it's pretty open knowledge, is, well, in those days, the bomb suits that we wore, the big things with the helmets, you'll notice that they don't have any sleeves, yeah? And the only reason that they, because you have to have your hands free to dismantle and do what you've got to do. And I raised this on the bomb course. I said, so what's going on there? And they said, well, mate, the truth is that the bomb suit is only designed to keep the body parts together in case you get blown up. Not really to save your life.
Pardon the pun. That blew my mind.
Yeah.
I turned to my husband and I was like, oh, you never guess what?
That's right.
That was the cracker. We didn't know that.
Yeah, I know. So if you look at, there's a great movie that I've seen, God, many times, called The Hurt Locker. It's an American movie.
Oh, that was what we were watching. I was like, you'll never guess what? You know that film?
Yeah. Yeah. So in the opening
yeah.
scene where the operator's running away and suddenly he's caught by the blast pressure wave and his head just explodes inside. Yeah, it's just the body parts together.
Yeah, that was amazing to learn that. I had no idea. That's very brutal, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah. But, you just become inured to that sort of stuff, I guess, when you're in that world. And most people who serve would say the same thing, whether they be first responders or military. Go, yeah, well, it is what it is, really. So, but I learned a lot and I enjoyed it. And then the following year, I was sent to work with the SAS in Perth, in Western Australia, at their barracks, and that was a counterterrorist instructor's course. So loved it all, and I thought, wow, I finally found somewhere that I love and I want to do for the rest of my career. I didn't want to be promoted out of it. I didn't want to do anything other than that, even though it was high risk, and because we really got very good at what we were doing, and we'd executed hundreds of high risk raids on houses, vehicles, offenders, and offenders were still armed. So this was well before the firearms amnesty. So there were lots of guns out there, and we'd never fired a shot. And I thought, yeah, that's, we're doing a really good job here. We're taking vicious people off the street. No shots are fired. It's a great thing to do. But again, the paradox of that was we trained very, very, very effectively to kill if we had to. When you're engaged in a gunfight with someone, you don't aim for the leg or the arm. And there's a very valid reason for that, because the leg or the arm is a much smaller target than the chest is. And if you miss with one of your shots, that shot can travel, it depends on what weapon you're using, but it will travel for hundreds of meters and can kill bystanders. So you only ever engage someone in what we call the center of the scene mass. So whatever part of the body you see, that's where you engage. So if it's front on, it's chest and head. So we were taught to shoot in the chest and the head to stop the threat, is the polite way to put it. So we were trained to kill, for sure. Because unfortunately, the story I'm about to tell you, I became involved in a gunfight, and the reality of it is not what you see in the movies, and it's not as clinical and as controlled as you train for either. So I did the course with the SAS and came back at the end of June, or it may have even been as quickly as mid-July. So in the office, I think I got a call. I might have got a call on the Sunday evening, but in a nutshell, because it's quite a long and involved story, and people should read it. So we were activated to start planning the arrest of Queensland's #1 most wanted armed robber, and I don't even like to use his name because he was a psychopath, and there was no. He had a traumatic childhood situation. Sometimes there are people who are just psychopaths. Sort of like Lord Byron, whose wife described him as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. Um, so, and this guy he'd been in the army. He came out. He was a violent armed robber. He was jailed. He escaped from jail. He'd been on the run for about 7 or 8 years, but he escaped from jail by viciously bashing a tradesman who'd gone into the jail to do some work, and fractured his skull, broke his ribs, not because he had to, just because he wanted to, and he escaped that way. During his time on the run, he'd committed quite a few armed robberies. He'd shot and killed someone in cold blood, an unarmed security guard. He'd shot and crippled another unarmed security guard outside the supermarket just because he wanted to. So, no compunction about that. We were given information or intelligence to look at a house that he was living in. And again, it's a long story how we found out, but it's in the book. So we were giving intel about the house. We looked at it and planned a number of options. So one of the options was waiting for him to leave on foot, and we could take him out then. And take him out is just police parlance for arrest and detain. But we discounted that because he was always armed, and he, again, would have fired shots without a problem, and those rounds posed a danger to the public, so we couldn't do that. We planned on taking him out in a vehicle intercept, discounted that for exactly the same reason. Then we thought of surrounding the house and calling on him to come out, but he was living there with his female accomplice, but more importantly, her 2 young children. So he would have had ready-made hostages. And a hostage situation can often go badly, particularly when you deal with someone like this. So the only thing we were left with really was the option of forcing entry to the house. Now, we had done that countless times before. I put what's called an operation order together, and the operation order is a very formalized, it's like a military document. It's a situation, mission, execution, administration, communication, logistics. It's all documented. And all the steps of a raid are documented. Everyone knows their role. So it took me, I can't remember, because I think we worked for about 2 days straight without any sleep. So a sergeant and I sat down, planned it, looked at it. I put the op order together, and I included the need for stun grenades or flashbangs, and everyone knows what flashbangs are. They're not shrapnel. They are a concussion grenade, and they activate anywhere between 7 and 9 times very, very quickly. And the sound wave and the light distracts someone almost completely for 10 to 15 seconds, enough time to take them down without any further issues. So I included flash grenades and the use of tear gas. The order went to police command, and it came back, and the use of both those pieces of equipment was denied. No explanation, just denied. And I still am quite bitter about this. This was the first week of our Royal Commission into Police Corruption. And the first 2 days, the evidence the Royal Commissioner had was laid out, and it was quite damning, or the indications were it was quite damning against the Commissioner of our police force and a number of senior police. And I thought this was great, because about time this was exposed. The majority of us were honest police. There was just a cohort who were making a lot of money and making it corruptly. But I'm still convinced without any proof, but certainly my observations and my intuition, is that those who refused permission for us to use those flashbangs and tear gas were concerned about the public um, opinion of the police because of the corruption inquiry, and they didn't want to have us do anything that might further upset anybody or look bad. So rather than ask why, they just said no. So we were then told when to execute the raid, and that had never happened before. Um, and again, in hindsight, I'm very certain we were told when to go into that raid because the headlines of the local papers should have been police capture number one most wanted, which would have taken some public notice away from the corruption headlines. And, that sounds a bit conspiratorial, but that's the way they operated. And that's the way a lot of police forces still do, and just deflect. And that's what they were after, a deflection. So he knew when we were coming, and he simply opened fire. There were times where I'd think, geez, I've just got to, I'm worried about who I'm turning into. I was working in the intelligence area and part of a national task force on outlaw motorcycle gangs and all of the cool stuff again. The only way to play this game is look, learn, observe and listen. But when I figure out who one of the other traders might be, absolutely be their friend and throw other people under the bus as long as it takes. So that's exactly what I did.